The SADF had achieved the first two objectives of Operation Modular. Firstly, stopping the FAPLA offensive against Mavinga, and secondly, inflicting maximum casualties and regaining the initiative from the enemy. They now felt ready to move on to the third and final objective, to destroy or drive out all FAPLA brigades east of the Cuito River. The current forces were not adequate to achieve this objective, so reinforcements were already on their way. The Rottle 90 had performed miracles in fighting against more heavily armed tanks, but if the South Africans wanted to stay in a dominant position on the battlefield, they would have to commit their heavy armour. For the first time ever, the SADF would be deploying its main battle tanks to the Angolan battlefield. A squadron of 13 Olifant tanks from the School of Armour boarded their tank transporters and left South Africa on October the 15th. From the 20th of October onwards, when they crossed the engineer bridge over the Cuito River into Angola, they would move forward on their own tracks. The Olifant tank is a modernized Centurion tank, armed with a 105mm gun and an improved diesel engine. From Cuito, the tanks drove onwards through hundreds of kilometers of thick bush and sand to the staging area in Mavinga. Joining the Olifants was the 4th South African Infantry Battalion, or 4SI. Similar in makeup to 61 Mech, 4SI was a mechanized infantry battalion, deploying the full range of Rottle fighting vehicles. Composed of national servicemen and their officers, 4SI was based in Middelburg and was commanded by Commandant Leon Marais. The large convoy brought the total number of South African troops up to just over 3,000. They would still be outnumbered, but they were confident that they had enough firepower to do the job. It was once again expected that the artillery would be the king of battle, and an extra battery of 8 G5s from Sierra Battery would be unwelcome news for FAPLA. As would the fact that South Africa was sending 3 pre-production G6 howitzers to the battle. These 37-ton monsters, each mounting a 155mm G5 on a massive wheeled body, were the cutting edge of the South African defence industry. The prototypes are so new that they were still being tested by the School of Artillery when they were ordered to drive over 1,800 kilometers from Potchefstroom to southern Angola. The vehicles handled the bush majestically and arrived in Mavinga in record time. By the end of October, all the mechanized elements of the offensive were near Mavinga, preparing for the battle to come. The continued shelling of Cuito River galvanized FAPLA into taking drastic action. Since withdrawing from the Lomba battlefield, 59 Brigade had been holding a defensive position on the WWII River. It was now ordered by the High Command at Cuito River to move south at full speed to find and destroy the G5s. This move on November the 1st was well timed, as the only South African forces in their way were the light infantry of Bravo Group. 61 Mech had withdrawn to Mavinga to prepare for the upcoming offensive. 400 men and a dozen Rottles from 32 Battalion would be fighting against 2,000 men and 16 tanks, hell-bent on destroying the precious G5s. The G5 battery was ordered to withdraw to safety, but mechanical problems and thick bush meant that by the morning of the 2nd of November, they were directly in the path of the attacking 59 Brigade units. The situation was so dangerous that Quebec Battery was ordered to withdraw its 50-plus vehicles in daylight. The order had hardly been given, however, when the first MiGs appeared overhead. The battery scattered and camouflaged itself in the thick bush. 4 guns managed to get away, but another 4 were stranded by broken clutches on their gun tractors and were now lame ducks in the path of the advancing FAPLA units. Though Colonel de Vries, acting commander whilst the Falcon was on leave, ordered units of 61 mech into the area, it would be up to the Buffaloes of 32 Battalion to save the G5s. With mortars and light weapons, the Buffaloes attacked their mechanized enemy. Major Hannes Northman and his anti-tank squadron attacked repeatedly to keep the advancing armour at bay. Northman had over a dozen contacts throughout the day, as 32 Battalion desperately tried to stop the tanks from reaching stranded artillery.
Get out of here.
By dusk, the tanks were less than a kilometre from the guns, but Northman kept up the pressure, even after 2 rifles were damaged by direct hits. Finally, an airstrike and a ripple of Valkyrie rockets managed to halt 59 Brigade as the sun was setting. Repair crews went in, and that night all the remaining guns and vehicles were withdrawn to safety. With South African forces apparently withdrawing from the battlefield in the south, coupled with inadequate intelligence, FAPLA was beginning to contemplate a renewal of their offensive against Mavinga. They had no idea, therefore, that the most powerful South African task force ever assembled was approaching from the east, bent on cutting off and destroying all FAPLA brigades east of Cuito River. The attack would be against 16 Brigade, who were not involved in the Lomba fighting, save for a few airstrikes. This brigade was holding the eastern perimeter of the new FAPLA defensive line, and if the South Africans could drive them from their positions by the source of the October River, they could then cut off all the FAPLA brigades from Cuito River and destroy them at will. The artillery opened up against a very surprised 16 Brigade early on the morning of November the 9th. They were followed by an airstrike flown by 6 Mirages. The 3 pre-production G6s of Juliet Troop made their combat debut at 6:30 that morning. Forsyth led the attack from the northeast, after 61 mech had made a diversionary attack from the southeast of 16 Brigade. In the thick bush, Unita infantry were sent ahead of the mechanized units in order to pinpoint the FAPLA positions. As the Unita began to drift back, the tankers knew that the SADF's first tank-on-tank clash since World War II was imminent. At 9 minutes past 8, Hein Milipap Fourie spotted a T-55. His brass cartridge case now stands in the School of Armour in Bloemfontein, the first tank kill for a South African tanker since World War II. Lieutenant Circus Leo Strauss bagged another tank for the South Africans 8 minutes later. As they drove deep into the FAPLA positions. Behind the tanks and the Rattle 90s came the mechanized infantry of 4 Psi, who dealt with the enemy bunkers in what turned out to be an outpost away from the main FAPLA positions. A BM-21 rocket launcher was destroyed, whilst the FAPLA prisoner indicated that the main positions of 16 Brigade were 4 kilometers away to the southwest. By 9:30, the outpost was cleared, and the SADF began moving against the main positions of 16 Brigade. The bush was very thick, and visibility was low, so it was decided to deploy the infantry of Delta Company ahead of the main force. FAPLA opened up on the advancing South Africans with direct and indirect fire. Mortars from 60 to 120 millimeters began to fall among the dismounted South Africans. Two men were killed and 4 wounded by a 120 millimeter mortar shell. Four Psi replied with mortars of their own, determined not to lose the momentum of the attack. FAPLA fought back tenaciously, using the deadly 23mm cannon in a ground support role. A burst from this deadly cannon tore apart a Rattle, killing the tail gunner, Sergeant DK. Another Rattle 20 of Bravo Company was surprised by a T-55, which appeared out of the bush only 50 meters away. The Rattle gunner, A. Tom, fired a stream of 20mm shells just below the commander's cupola. This caused an internal explosion, which destroyed the tank. A second T-55 appeared moments later, however, just after the infantry got clear. Tom and the Rattle driver were killed in the explosion. The infantrymen who got clear of the Rattle were soon fighting for their lives against entrenched FAPLA machine guns. Rifleman P.G. Claassen was killed moments before the T-55 was finally knocked out by an Olifant. The tanks now took over, moving in front of the embattled Bravo Company, and came into contact almost immediately with advancing FAPLA tanks. In the close bush, the tank that shot first was the tank that lived. The ensuing armoured clash ended with 5 T-55s destroyed and 1 captured intact, whilst 1 Olifant was lightly damaged but withdrew under its own power. At 11:30, 4 MiG-23s appeared overhead. They attacked the South Africans with rocket fire, though they did not cause any casualties. They did, however, give 16 Brigade the time to withdraw from their positions. By 2:30, 4 Psi had cleared the FAPLA positions. They were not, however, able to pursue 16 Brigade, as FAPLA stragglers were interfering with the evacuation of the wounded. With his medical and surgical staff at risk, Commandant Maré did not want any further casualties that day, He had already lost 7 men killed and 9 wounded. It was imperative to reach the source of the Cuito River and cut off FAPLA's line of retreat. Force I and the rest of Combat Group Charlie were advancing from the north when the air raid warning was given. As the vehicle scattered, a conscript shot himself in the stomach, jumping from his vehicle. To save his life, the surgeons had to operate him on the spot, and without surgical support for the remaining units, the attack was again postponed until the next day. It fell therefore on the artillery to keep up the pressure on 16 Brigade. The 3 G6s of Juliet Troop and 16 G5s of Quebec and Sierra Battery fired 1,134 howitzer shells on November the 10th, together with over 1,000 rockets from the MRLs of Papa Battery. The strain on the artillery had fatal consequences the next morning. As the G5s fired the preparatory barrage before the attack by Combat Group Charlie, the ceasefire command was given, whilst the shell was still in the breech of the howitzer. As the men waited for the order to resume firing, the enormous heat from the gun transferred to the high explosive shell. 2 men were killed instantly and 8 were severely wounded. Casualty evacuation by helicopter during the daylight hours was forbidden due to the likely presence of MiG-23s. However, because of the long wait till darkness and the severity of the wounds, it was decided that if a helicopter were not risked, the men would surely die. A single Puma helicopter, piloted by Captain Koos Myburg, flew at treetop level towards the casualties. Two Mirage CZ fighters were tasked to escort the Puma and distract any MiGs, although they were to avoid combat. There were a few tense moments along the way, but all the men were evacuated without further incidents and the MiGs avoided. The wounded soldiers survived thanks to the bravery of the South African airmen. There were 2 objectives for the South African attack of November the 11th. Objective Alpha was the strong point guarding the gap between the SADF and the source of the Cuito River. Objective Bravo was the enemy strong point on the source of the Chambinga River. If the South Africans could overrun both objectives, the 3 FAPLA brigades to the south would be cut off from retreat back to Cuito Carnival. A very thick bush delayed the tanks and infantrymen of Combat Group Charlie. FAPLA used the delay to withdraw from their positions at Objective Alpha. They also sent in wave after wave of MiGs to bomb the SADF forces. This started a furious battle between the MiGs and the anti-aircraft gunners, who frantically fired their 20mm cannons to try and spoil the aim of the fighters. The ACAC gunner was wounded by the bomb fragments, but the attack went ahead. With visibility once again low, the infantry probed ahead through the dense foliage. Force I and the rest of Combat Group Charlie reached Objective Alpha just before noon. The positions were deserted by FAPLA as the infantry went about the dangerous task of bunker clearing. The South Africans were eager to proceed to Objective Bravo, where they expected at least 2 infantry battalions and 22 tanks to put up a more spirited resistance. 6 Mirages opened up the attack on Objective Bravo, tossing in dozens of bombs just after noon. The infantry once again fanned out ahead as the bush got progressively thicker. After covering a grueling 6 kilometers on foot, Commandant Maria agreed to give the infantrymen a rest at about 2 p.m. However, the SADF had stopped to rest in an area under FAPLA observation, and they lost no time in putting their own defensive fire plan into action. The Olifants immediately initiated a fire melt action, all firing simultaneously at any suspected targets.
Fire.
This bought time for the infantry to regroup and for the attack to continue. However, FAPLA snipers, in trees, opened up a devastating fire on the dismounted infantry. Before they were suppressed, the snipers had killed 2 and wounded 5 infantry. The infantry and rifles charged ahead, desperate to regain the initiative. However, they soon found themselves face to face with aggressively handled T-55s. In a scene reminiscent of the 9th, a Rifle 20 gunner, Rifleman M.J. Midden, knocked out an enemy tank with a stream of shells, and then was himself knocked out by a second tank that appeared seconds later. In the burning wreck, the fatally wounded Midden attempted to save the Rifle driver, but both men perished that day. The Olifants stabilized the situation, and the attack continued. As the SADF realized that it had driven into a FAPLA minefield, a T-55 attacked the stranded Rifle. The 100mm shell ripped the Rifle apart, killing the driver. The Olifant was recovered, but with his troops stranded in a minefield, Commandant Marais decided to withdraw in order to avoid attack from the air. The higher command was unhappy with yet another delay and ordered 61 Mech and Combat Group Alpha to take over the attack, with 4 Psi moving to the reserve. Darkness was falling, however, and the units went into their lagers. The South African attacks over the previous days had killed nearly 500 FAPLA and destroyed over a dozen tanks, for the loss of 12 men killed and 4 Rifles destroyed. However, they had failed to close the vital Chambinga gap, through which the FAPLA units could retreat. The Angolan government was fully aware that they were facing catastrophe on the battlefield. In fact, they overestimated the size and intentions of the South African forces, and were convinced that they were about to lose the southeast of their country. As they saw it, if their best units were destroyed, they would have to abandon Cuito River and retreat 200 kilometers north to Manong. In this, their darkest hour, they appealed to their allies for salvation, for aid. The Soviet Union had shot its bolt and would risk no further involvement. Cuba answered the call.
El 15 de noviembre, reunión del Estado Mayor y la Dirección, presidida por Fidel, se tomó la decisión de resolver el problema de una vez y para siempre. Expulsar a los surafricanos de Angola. Para expulsar a los surafricanos de Angola no eran con 10 hombres ni con los 20.000 que teníamos. Se requerían grandes fuerzas antiaéreas, aéreas, blindados y artillería. Sacando de nuestra propia fuerza, sacándolas de Cuba. Toda la mejor artillería antiaérea que tenemos en Cuba se envió para allá. Cuando teníamos aquí las amenazas de agresión contra Cuba, el gobierno Reagan, todo eso. Pero bueno, había que resolver aquella situación.